Perfect. Okay, so you are welcome to throw your questions in the chat. We will get to them after Francesca finishes her talk. And because it's just 1 hour or less now, if we don't get to answer your questions, you are welcome to contact us after this talk. Well, I'm gonna start introducing Francesca Claverie, my good friend from Patagonia and from Calexico. She, like I said, she's from Calexico, California. Her family has strong roots on both sides of the US-Mexico border. So that's something we share in common, Francesca and I. Francesca started working with native plants at the UC Davis Arboretum while in college, and after graduating with degrees in Native American Studies and International Agriculture Development. Continued as a manager, assisting with propagation, research, and organizing plant sales. In 2013, she moved to Patagonia, Arizona, for an internship with Native Seed Search, and shortly after started the nursery for Borderlands Restoration. She is passionate about increasing accessibility and enthusiasm for native plants, which I love, and promoting partnerships between nurseries and plant programs on both sides of the border. She serves on the board of the Sweetwater Center in Campbell, Arizona, and is an elected town council person for the town of Patagonia. Thank you so much, Francesca, for being here today, and thank you all for joining us. And I'm just gonna pass to you.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. For sure, the best bat expert that I've ever met in my life is Debbie, who is going to be leading the walk on Wednesday with Watershed Management Group. And I mean, this woman is so amazing. She has like pet bats that she hides in her clothes. Like she's just one of the most impressive bat enthusiasts ever. But I was really happy when Christian reached out to me about this, because all of my work with bats and thinking about bats has all been in the context of native plant restoration and native agave work for bats. And through that, and through working with Bat Conservation International, I'm just a huge fan now, and I hope that all of you become fans of bats as well. Oh, it worked. Okay. Christian, did the slide move?
Yeah.
Okay, it's working. So quickly, I work for Borderlands Restoration Network. We're a nonprofit based in Patagonia, Arizona, that works with habitat restoration for wildlife and for the landscape. We build erosion control structures, lots of rock piling, and then I manage our native plant program, where we put seeds that are locally sourced and container plants back onto the landscape. We then also like to connect people with this work through talks like this, through youth education programs, through our Sonoran Field School, through our wonderful volunteers that come and work with us throughout the week. And I've been working with Borderlands for a decade now. This is my 10-year anniversary. This is a little map of the area in which we work. You can kind of see that it's zoomed in. And we're very, very watershed focused. When we think about pollinators, like the specific bats that we work with, and then think about plant genetics, oftentimes it's harder for some of these pollinators to fly over mountaintops. Bats are actually kind of a cool exception to that. So we're very, very watershed focused with our ecological restoration work, and thinking about putting the right seeds in the right place at the right time, so that we can revegetate these degraded landscapes. This is the program that I direct, our Borderlands Nursery and Seed program. If you hear any dogs barking in the distance, I have the door cracked and my little pups are with me. just chewing on sticks and running around, but they occasionally do bark. So if you hear any barking, it's probably from me. We have a great program that works with collecting wild seed, with growing plants in nurseries, and then with planting those plants out into our farmed increaser plots. We work with a lot of different native plant species, and if you're not a big fan of native plants, I really encourage you to become one because they're absolutely amazing and critical for the landscape. This is a way to think about a quick map of local ecotypes, and we're kind of zoomed in to our region. And when we talk about using the right plants for the right species, we kind of think about them on these larger landscape areas. So we work within watersheds, but then especially when you start thinking about bats, you want to really use plants from the right ecotype at the right elevation. And there's so much diversity in that of what kind of plants grow where, and also where you should be planting them out. All right, getting into bats, because this is what we're here to talk about. The obvious thing is bats are the only true flying mammals. So all bats can fly and not glide like flying squirrels or other like pseudo flying animals. Every continent in the world has bat species except for Antarctica. And there are over 1,400 species of bats worldwide. This is something I want you to think about because bats make up 1/4 of all mammal diversity. And so when you think about how many different species of bats in the world there are, basically mammals evolutionarily pretty early on broke off into flying mammals. And that's why there's such an incredible diversity of bats. There's no way I'm going to hit on even like all of the species. I'm not really going to do a list of like every species, even in our region, but just to really give you a scope. Anywhere you travel, think about the bats and the ecosystem services that they provide. 1/3 of these different species are threatened or endangered. Bats get an incredibly bad rap, partly because they're mysterious. They are nocturnal, so they come out at night. And people don't know a lot about them, and we associate them heavily with disease, sometimes for really good reasons and sometimes for like ridiculous over the top reasons. So even when you think about the big COVID, our big COVID situation over the last few years, it's sourced to, potentially a bat took this on, passed this on to a different mammal that then came on to humans. And even during that time for bats and COVID, a lot of caves were destroyed. People kind of targeted these animals just out of fear and not really understanding how they work. And, they also use echolocation, which is really cool. Interestingly enough, bats are not blind. When I give classes on bats and agaves to groups that come in and ask for like basic bat facts, what do people know about bats? And it's always like, oh yeah, they're flying mammals or they use echolocation. But so often people think that they're blind, and they actually have very similar eyesight as humans. They just hang out at night a lot. Something really important to think about, and this is important for restoration with bats, and especially habitat restoration and conservation around bats, is these guys only have 1, maybe 2 babies a year. So most often when people see these huge colonies of bats, kind of like the free-tail bats that you'd see on Wednesday if you go to the cave or the bridge event, people see so many bats and they just kind of think like, ugh, rats of the sky, or like, oh, just all of these gross little animals that are taking over the airwaves and like maybe pooping on me, or like it's just so disgusting. But really, when these animals get hit by disease or like deforestation and they lose food sources, or we start poisoning insects and they don't have enough to eat, it really does take a long time for bats to come back. A great organization that you should follow, and that I've stolen many of my slides from, is Bat Conservation International. They're our partners for our Agave for Bats projects, and they work globally. They're a really incredible organization. They're working with bat conservation issues all over the world. And something that's so fun about bats is just how incredibly varied they are. So the bats that we have in our region aren't that big, but you see on the picture, like these flying foxes, or like some of the tiniest little bats in the world are no bigger than like insects. And this is kind of the range. Like you look at the flying foxes, these are the biggest bats in the world. They live in the South Pacific. They eat fruit. And the smallest bat is this little bumblebee bat that's smaller than a thumbnail. Like that's just such an incredible amount of biodiversity within the bat world. Yeah, for the most part, the ones we have here are like pretty normal, pretty like smaller than your hand size. This is not a fancy slide. This slide is talking about diseases, and I was like, well, this is actually kind of important, and I don't want to fancy it up because it's about diseases. People associate bats heavily with rabies. Overall, less than 1% of bats have rabies. However, because they do live often in colonies of thousands, it's very possible that if you do see a sick bat that's wandering around during the day and trying to fly, don't touch them. And that's for a lot of good reasons. But even when we've done when we've worked with Debbie, who's come down to do bat classes with us, unless you're vaccinated for rabies, you really shouldn't be touching bats. Make sure you wear gloves, and make sure if you have to move one out of a house that you're able to catch it carefully, and and just be really careful with it. There's also diseases like histoplasmosis, which can make you sick. It can't make you terribly sick, but if you're trying to, say, like clean out an attic and you know that there are bats in there, be really careful and wear masks. They poop a lot, which is like a great thing because they're producing all this guano, and they take all those insects and all of the nectar that they're consuming, and they're putting it back into nutrients. But when you just have massive piles of poop places and massive piles of guano, you do have to be careful for diseases, and wear gloves, wear a mask. And then on the bat side of things, PD, which is Pseudogymnoscus distractans, this causes white nose syndrome. And this is a huge problem that has actually been found in Arizona, in our neck of the woods, a few times, but for the most part is a huge problem on the East Coast. And this was brought over fairly recently. They don't exactly know how it got to the East Coast, but it's just killed millions and millions of bats. And a big problem with this is not so much that it makes them sick and just kills them immediately, but it causes them to wake up when they're hibernating. So on the East Coast, it's very, very cold, and the bats really do need to hibernate. And so when they're like sick and don't feel well, they come in and out of hibernation, and it causes them to lose their reserves and they die. And again, this has been devastating, not just because of all the bats it's killing, but how slowly it actually takes for these populations to rebound, because they don't produce as many babies as like even a cat or a dog per year. They just produce very few young. And then also, if you're on the East Coast, like imagine each bat is able to eat like thousands and thousands of insects and mosquitoes and all of these insects that kind of mess with us every night. And when that's gone, you then can, humans can be susceptible to disease for not having these bats kind of protect us. Long story short, if you see a bat that's sick and like hanging around your house, or especially if there's a pond nearby, just contact Game and Fish. It's important for them to know and get them tested. I had a friend outside Patagonia who actually ended up getting, her horse got rabies and some of her cows had rabies. And they had like found out because of a really sick bat that they found. And then everyone in the house ended up having to get rabies shots. It was high drama. So leave the bats alone, and just appreciate them from afar. So Christian doesn't know this, But the main reason I decided to do this talk is just because I want to talk about vampire bats. I think vampire bats are the coolest thing ever. We have, I'll go over how many species we have specifically in Arizona, but in the entire Sonoran Desert, we have 70 different species of bats. A handful of those, a very small percentage, are nectar feeding. Most of them are insect eating. That's the majority of most bats in the world are insect eating. But I am a huge fan of vampire bats. And I only put pictures in this on this slide of vampire bats because the first time I did any bat work, any agave for bat work in Mexico, we went down to Sonora. We gave a nice little talk on how bats are really cool. They pollinate the agaves. You're growing agaves. You should let some of these agaves flower for bats. And the first question we got was from a woman who was very wise and knew her stuff. And she goes, no, we don't like the bats. They eat our cattle. And I was like, I thought about it for a bit and I was like, that seems so extreme. And then I was like, oh my God, I forgot that in Sonora, there are vampire bats. And vampire bats drink blood, obviously. They're one of the only mammals, they might be the only mammal that survives on eating blood, on only consuming blood. And it's such a fascinating tale because the BCI people, Bat Conservation International people, they hate talking about vampire bats because it like freaks everybody out so much. So they're just like, oh yeah, and vampire bats. Vampire bats weren't doing well evolutionarily in the Americas. They were having a hard time after the Ice Age and all of this megafauna that started dwindling. They were connected to, the mastodons and the giant sloths and these huge animals that roamed the Americas. And that was what they were using to sustain themselves. And then something, kind of horrible, but very significant happened when white people came and colonized and they brought cattle. And so they brought all these huge animals that we started raising. And you know what? Vampire bats are back, baby. They've like spread. They're in Brazil, they're kind of all over the warmer areas of the Americas, but they're in Sonora and they've moved up to Sonora. And I always love, like one of my favorite questions for the bat scientists is discussing with them whether or not they think vampire bats are going to show up in the United States ever. And they're like, some people are just like, it's just too cold. We think it's too cold. And then some bat scientists are like, we do think they're going to show up at some point, but our cattle, the cattle industry is going to just really go after them and really attack them. Because as you can see from this weird taxidermied picture of this goat being chomped on by a vampire bat, people like the bat doesn't actually like eat or kill or even hurt the cow. What it does though is like with mosquitoes and like with a lot of other bloodborne illnesses, if you have one sick cow and then you have vampire bats feeding on it, they end up spreading a disease that cow has to the rest of the herd, which, you're trying to like keep one sick cow away from the others. And then you have these vampire bats like spreading whatever that cow has to the other ones. So that's why they don't like them. The cows are fine. They're big animals. They have plenty of blood. And the other thing that people think is like a vampire bat would just like fly up and attack you in the throat and like start sucking on your throat. And you have to like pull this bat out. But actually, on the picture on the left, you see their like cute little arms. Vampire bats fly, they like find a herd of cattle and they fly to the ground and then they walk and they're very small. You can like hold them. I mean, don't hold them for a lot of reasons, but they're very small. They like fit in your hands. They're not big animals. They don't weigh very much. And they walk on their funny little arms, like little stilts. They walk over to the cow and then like walk up to the cow, and instead of just like piercing in like in the movies and sucking blood, they actually have an anticoagulant in their spit, and so they make a little cut. And I almost put the photo in, but I was like, it's too gross, I'm not gonna put it in for the presentation. But the blood like runs down, and then they have these little tubes that they kind of like suck the blood out of. So I think they're just like kind of ridiculously cute. I mean, and even look at their two little front teeth. Like we just think of vampires, like we have those silly Halloween things we use. Like they're just like really cute little animals. So I'm sorry for going into vampire bats for so long, but I'm a huge fan, and I just think it's the coolest thing ever. Out of all this, you know, when you think about bat diversity in the borderlands, your one takeaway should just be like, hey, we got vampire bats, and maybe they'll come to Arizona one day in our lifetimes. It's possible. And the cattle people will fight them, but I just think it's the coolest thing ever. And I heard from someone recently that actually the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum, like back in the 60s, had the only population of captive vampire bats in the world and kept them going for a pretty long time. And then something happened, but they had to like transport blood in to feed them. Like it was this whole thing. It's pretty interesting. So I had to highlight the vampires. Okay, going to now Arizona bats. We have 28 species of bats in Arizona. 2 of these are nectar eaters. These are all smaller bats. They're like fist size or smaller. We don't have any vampire bats in our state. They all eat insects except for our 2 species that eat nectar. And those are the 2 that I know about the most, and I'll go into great detail. Some of these are pretty common, like the cave myotis. We have 9 different species of myotis bats, to put that into perspective here in Arizona. There's a great range. We have some that are like pretty endangered and pretty hard to find and just are very solitary and we don't know much about. And then we have bats like the Mexican free-tailed bat that live in some of the largest colonies in the world. There's like caves of millions of them in Texas that are really famous, the Bracken Cave. They just do really well. They're great at living in colonies, and they're fairly common like all over the West. They do really, really well. What was the one other thing I was going to mention about the Arizona bats? I forgot. I think I just wanted to say talk about the myotis for sure. But yeah, so all of these, we have the highest diversity of bats in the US outside of Texas. Texas gets us with like, you know, they have more milkweed species than we do. We have like the 2nd highest diversity in milkweeds. We also have the 2nd high diversity in bats. Texas takes the cake. Good work, Texas. They're a big state. Oh, let me go back. Okay. Of all the bat species in the world, so of the over 1,400 species, 100 of these eat nectar and fruit. So you see like these cute little pictures at the bottom of the fruit, the little nectivorous bats. Spoiler alert, the bat on the right is the one that I'm obsessed with and that we do the most work for. This is the lesser long-nosed bat, Leptonicterus yerbabuene. And there it is hitting an agave. And you can see kind of how small they are, just based on this one agave flower. Over 300 plants are pollinated by bats. It's interesting when we talk about pollination by bats because they often bat scientists like to use fruiting and pollination as a way to have to justify why bats are important. People think they're weird or gross or aren't interested in bats, but then, you know, you always have the bat people go, oh, but look, you wouldn't have a banana if it wasn't for a bat. They say the same thing about agaves, where you wouldn't have tequila if it weren't for bats, but that's not exactly true. Because one of the issues we're running into is people not letting the agaves flower. But in order to have genetic diversity in your agave population, you need bats because you want them to pollinate the agave stalk for seed. So unlike some of these other fruits that really are dependent directly on bat pollination, agaves are a little bit different, but they are definitely pollinated by bats. Just in case people don't know what pollination is, it's pretty straightforward. A plant puts out nectar to attract an animal, often an insect, but it could be a mammal or a lizard or a bird, to come and feed on that plant. And when the pollinator goes in, it ends up moving the pollen around, which is the only way that plants can have sex. This is critical for plant life in the world. And if you were a plant, this is something I like to think about a lot. We kind of just think of like plants doing things arbitrarily or just randomly coming up with reasons to flower. But if you were a plant and if you were an agave that live in these really drought-stricken areas where there aren't massive populations all over the place, it's really important to have a pollinator like a bat that can travel long distances. And these little lesser long-nosed bats can really travel all over the place. I think they're recorded for going up to 200 kilometers in one night, which is really, really incredible distance for them to be able to hit all of these different agaves. And that helps the agave become more resilient with the seeds, where they're taking information from large populations, moving them around. And it's also one of the reasons that agaves are pretty hybridized. Here is a photo of the lesser long-nosed bat going to a saguaro plant. And this is like to me, just one of the coolest photos ever taken, where they sliced this saguaro flower and got the bat to stick its little face in to pollinate it. So you can really see, like, firstly, how that pollination is happening, but then how the plant is really covering the little fuzzy bat. Let me see, I have a few more pictures. Really covering the little fuzzy bat with pollen as it moves to each plant. So here are our main bat species in the Southwest US and Northern Mexico. On the left, we have Leptonicterus nivalis. This bat is mostly in Northeast Mexico and Southeast US. It's still endangered, and it is found in the Southwest in the boot heel of like Southwestern New Mexico. It pops up weirdly in this one area where it still visits this cave. It's pretty cool. The recently delisted lesser long-nosed bat is the most common bat you'll see here. And if you have hummingbird feeders that you put out, or you have a flowering agave or a flowering saguaro, and you see a bat hit it, 99% it's going to be the lesser long-nosed bat. This bat was delisted in 2011 or 12, I believe, and it was highly controversial when they did that. There's a lot of reasons that bat populations are having a hard time, between people destroying caves when they dig out guano, to the COVID scare, to just decreasing food availability, like agave nectar on the landscape. They already have a really long migration they have to get through. And this happened under Trump, and bat biologists were pissed and made a big deal about it. And because of that, there's still a lot of energy going into making sure that the lesser long-nosed bat population stays protected, and that we're able to plant enough food for it. On the right is my favorite, my very favorite nectar feeding bat. This is the Mexican long-tongue bat. I would love to see one in person. I have friends that net for bats, and they come out very rarely. They don't know a lot about them. They're not sure if they migrate. They don't know a lot about their numbers. They assume they migrate, but they don't know. They sometimes hang out in the lesser long-nosed bat caves, but they're just very, very few. And because of that, they're trying to figure out how to designate them. But that's the Mexican long-tongued bat, Chironicterus mexicana. And they have like the funny snout. I feel like anytime we do talks about agaves for bats, the lesser long-nosed bat is just an incredibly charismatic species to work with. I'm not gonna lie, some of the bats are just downright ugly. I don't think they're very attractive. I think they're interesting. But this little guy is so cute and has like the big black eyes and just the cute little ears and cute little fuzzy face. And these bats, they do this amazing migration. The reason they don't include the Mexican long-tongue is they're just not sure about their migration. But these guys, they live the winters in Oaxaca. They hang out in central and southern Mexico. And then the pregnant females are the ones that migrate north. And they're coming up specifically for the saguaro bloom. They kind of time it perfectly. They have their summer homes, their summer maternity caves that they come up super preggers, they hit the saguaros, and then on their way back, they really depend on flowering agave populations. Oh yeah, this is a cute little video. Can you guys see the video, Christian? Yeah. So here's a video of a lesser long-nosed bat pollinating an agave. And you can see how it's like getting covered in pollen. Here's like a picture, an up-close picture, slowed down, of the little bat getting into the flower. And then on the left is the cute little picture of it just covered in pollen. And that's like one of my favorites, where it's just, this guy just really went for it and is absolutely covered in pollen to take to each new agave that it visits. This is something that is so important and is one of the funniest things, I think, and like kind of obscene if you're a woman and you think about this. So one of the reasons that bats only have like 1 to maybe 2 pups a year, they call their babies pups, is because a pregnant bat, the baby takes up 1/3 of the mom's body weight. So if you're a 100-pound woman, that's like birthing a 30-pound child, to put that into perspective of just how obscene that is. And so on the left, there's this super pregnant little lesser long-nosed bat, and then on the right is when the baby's born. And the moms will sometimes fly around with the babies, but then also can leave them in the caves. And it's just pretty cute to have like this pretty large child sucking all the nutrients out of you while you're hitting up the saguaros and the agaves. And this is where they've done a lot of studies specifically on why they're coming up for these agave flowering events. And they think it's special amino acids that are in the nectar of the agaves that are really drawing the pregnant females, because there's plenty of flowering things in Mexico. And you think, you would stay in your area and not come all the way up for the saguaros, because it's quite a trek. Getting into agaves, everyone then also has to convince people why agaves are important, a cultural resource, both for, mezcal, but also agave nectar and pulque and even cattle feed. They're probably the most economically used native plant in Mexico. They grow all over Mexico. They originated in Mexico. They evolved in Mexico. And they're one of the most iconic plants in the world at this point. More beautiful flowering agave photos. These agaves are important and have this relationship for bats and make excellent food, partly because any tree that can provide nectar for bats, or any small plant, generally those perennial plants, they flower year after year. And so they're giving a certain percentage to the pollinators to make sure that they can seed every year. Whereas agaves are using all of their energy. They grow over decades. The agave palmeri in our region, from seed to flower, can be 30 years in the making. And this whole time, the agave is getting bigger and bigger and putting sugars into its base. And then it flowers once. They're monocarpic. And so when they're just shooting out that amount of nectar, this makes it an excellent food source for these migrating bats to hit. Let's see. I think I have another slide to talk. Yeah. So when we talk about like an endangered species, the Leptonicterus nivalis is still very much endangered, and the population has declined by 50% in the last 50 or so years that they've been heavily studying this population of bat. They think this is in large part to cave accessibility, as well as just flowering agaves on the landscape and how that's changed in the northeast of Mexico. Northeastern Mexico doesn't have nearly as many columnar cactus as the West. And so they think that our Leptonicterus yerbabuena species, the lesser long-nosed bat here in the West, has like more opportunity for getting good nutrients. Whereas this one on the east is being hit heavily and like depends mostly on agaves. So with this restoration project of planting more agaves on the landscape, the goal is to go from landscapes that are looking like this, where there's not a single agave flowering in sight, to something like this. Very dramatic. This is a beautiful photo. It's kind of a cheater photo because it's taken from a really cool population of Agave Perryi huachucensis in Patagonia. And this is like the poster boy photo because you have all these beautiful flowering agaves. However, when we get back to what I was talking about at the beginning of my presentation and picking the right plants for these types of projects, Agave Perryi actually doesn't flower at the right time for our nectar feeding bats. It obviously wants to be pollinated by bats. And for this reason, we think that's maybe why the seed set is not so great. You can collect quite a bit of seed from these flowering stalks, but the germination isn't great on those seeds. We work with Agave palmeri, the Palmer's agave, which is a little more solitary. You don't see it in big patches like this. It's a really cool, truly wild agave, and it flowers at the end of summer. And this is when, like about now is when they're all flowering. And this is when we get lesser long-nosed bats in our maternity roosts in this part of southeastern Arizona. In Tucson, where you guys are, they show up and like hit the pinacate in like April and May. They hang out in that area of Tucson and around for the saguaros. And then they come into the mountains for this big late Agave palmeri bloom. So I shouldn't have delved into the specifics with this photo, but I always think it's funny that this is the charismatic photo that everyone wants to take, but it's actually kind of the wrong species to plant in our area. So that's why we're planting palmeris. But you still got to take sexy photos of the agaves when you can, because they look so good. So these, planting all these helps restore nectar corridors. They are targeting areas that are close to bat maternity roosts. And this is really important and something that I definitely let the bat people take care of. We know where a couple of our caves are in the Patagonia mountains, but for the most part, even when we're trying to get information on where caves are, landowners and agencies do a really good job of keeping those locations secret. So even like when we have the maps that are shared, even with us of like where some of the sites are that they've done restoration work or where there are caves in the US and in Mexico, these are like where they've, where they've done some restoration and have nurseries growing out plants. But they're really careful to put them near caves, but to not tell people where the caves are. Because to this day, people talk about going into the caves and taking guano, or even just because they like hate the bats or want to kill the vampire bats. You know, people get really weirded out by them, and it's a shame. Here's a bunch of the partners for this restoration initiative that BCI is working with. We have some amazing nursery growers in this neck of the woods, like the Gila Watershed Partnership. They're located over in Safford. And Steve Plath just retired from there, but hands down, he's grown some of the best agaves I've ever seen. But this is something that's definitely a massive community effort that BCI is on top of, but like really being able to identify where are the best needs to put agaves. Maybe it's in a recently burned area on Fort Huachuca because there are caves nearby. Maybe it's after, you know, maybe it's in an area where we're not seeing as many palmeri recruiting, and we know there's a maternity cave nearby, but it really does take people like identifying spots, agencies supporting these projects, and having nurseries, either private or nonprofit or government nurseries that can then do the local seed collection and produce the plants. We've done a lot of seed collection for Bat Conservation International. Honestly, seed collection is one of the more fun things. And the last time we collected seed was years ago, and we just have millions of seed from like the 100 agaves or whatever that we hit. And that seed is like great for the whole region. And they're putting these nurseries up in Texas, they're putting them in New Mexico. And we've given classes on encouraging people how to collect seed, both in Mexico and the US, so that you can use regionally sourced seed. Because agaves flower so, because bats like will fly long distances to each agave, you can use them in a wider regional sense, you like this seed that's from the Chiricahuas would also be fine for like seed in the Patagonias. Once you start going too far away, like I wouldn't want to use the seed we collected for projects in Texas, for example. But the idea is to not buy seed from the wrong place, but to collect it yourself. And it's very easy to get all the seed. On the left here is flowering, like dried flowers, and a bunch of seeds in, I think this is Allegra's hand. The white ones are unfilled seed, and the black ones are filled seed that work. And then getting to work planting these guys. The plant on the right is one that we grew that a bunch of little Boy Scouts came and planted. And then on the left here, we have the Bacanora producers that are getting really involved with doing their own restoration, like partly selfishly so that they can continue to have Bacanora and agaves to make the regional agave distillate of the area, but also they're realizing growing, you know, you can get millions of seeds off, you know, 20 or so plants versus like buying that many pups or clones of the plant. It takes a little more time, but it's actually much more economical to do the seed collection and grow these plants out from seed. Here's a cool project we did over at Coronado National Historic Monument back in 2017 or so. And then on the right is a group that helped us plant in Patagonia. And we found it was definitely the ones we put a ton of rocks around, they did way better, way more successful. The ones that we had established before that massive drought of 2020, a lot of them did just fine in the long run. And we had successes of like 60 to 75% from those plantings. And stuff that we planted during the drought of 2020 was like horrible numbers, where the javelinas just showed up and killed all of our babies. It's really depressing sometimes. But you definitely need to like make sure you're planting with the rains, mulch them really well with rocks, make sure they're a decent enough size, and then pray for rain and pray that animals have other things to eat. Here's a map of some cool planting sites. You can see Tucson over here, and these like higher elevation areas where the bats have their maternity roosts nearby. Another thing is like, instead of just planting all new agaves, really identifying where there are already happy patches of agaves and protecting those and keeping the cattle out. When an agave puts up its flowering stalk, those stalks are very nutritious and very tasty and very sugary. And if the cattle don't have a ton to eat, cattle or deer just like munch down on that stalk. Agaves are in the asparagus family. It's not like a crazy jump to make. They used to be in their own family, and then the geneticists were like, oh my God, they're actually really closely related to asparagus, which is kind of fun. When you see this picture, it seems like a no-brainer. But this is a patch that they're protecting in the Monterrey area in northeastern Mexico to keep these patches around to flower. And so, yeah, they don't just get decimated. The last part of this presentation, I want to talk about restoration efforts in Sonora, specifically around the lesser long-nosed bat, because this is one of the things that's hurting the bats the most. All over Sonora, because the US and Europe is all of a sudden in the last couple decades really getting excited about delicious mezcal and agave spirit bottles that you can buy. People have gotten super into it, and the demand has increased rapidly. The Bacanora is the regional distillate, agave distillate of Sonora. It has its own denomination of origin and is a protected plant that is still used for, like they wild harvest this plant to this day. In our lifetime, we're probably going to stop seeing wild agaves in Sonora. They're being decimated so quickly. It's even hard to find them to do surveys of. There are some ranches that are Bacanora ranches that have thousands and thousands of hectares, and they're doing a good job of keeping track of what's there and then replanting the pups or the hijuelos. So it's a really important cultural drink that people are really excited about because they're able to make money off of this drink that was illegal to make for so many years. Right now, they're still trying to kind of regulate the industry, and we've been working with our partners in Sonora to work with the Mexican government, the state of Sonora, to include sustainability regulations in the entire denomination of Bacanora. This is kind of a fun map because the arrows are the bat migration of where the bats come up on the coast and hit all those columnar cactus and then come into Tucson. Where's Tucson? Tucson area for the saguaros, and then on their way back, they're more in the Sierra when they're flying back, and they're depending a lot on this agave angustifolia to be flowering. This is also a map of where the current denomination of origin is for Bacanora. So when we think about what some of the biggest stressors are to the lesser long-nosed bat, it's the fact that they end up flying back and there aren't any flowering agaves because they've all been cut down to make booze out of. So with that, there's incredible groups, community groups all over Sonora full of really badass, young, educated biologists that have been working with the producers, both to encourage like letting some of them flower, you can collect seed, and we can give you some plants to let flower that can become your seed stock. And BCI has been funding this effort. And I think it's really incredible. Some of the regulation that they're currently working on approving with the DO guidelines, the denomination of origin guidelines, is to let 1% of the crop flower for bats, which when you have, thousands of agaves flowering ends up being a fair amount. And if they want to increase production, it will allow for as they turn agaves into an agricultural industry, that will then grow the amount of nectar that's available. They also make sure that they do pest monitoring so that they're not spraying the agaves. Similar to other pollinators, when you spray agaves for pests, especially some of the really nasty chemicals that are used, that actually goes into a flowering stalk and can then hurt the bat and the hummingbirds and all of the pollinators that are depending on that agave to flower. There's also really interesting evidence that I think is fascinating about if any of you have ever drank tequila before. I feel like tequila is notorious for having one of the worst hangovers ever, where people will talk about, oh my God, that tequila hangover. Well, oftentimes it's not just alcohol poisoning that you're getting when you overdrink it. You're also getting pesticide poisoning because so many of these really big brands are putting pests that are not legal to even spray in the US. Of course, they buy it from the US because we make nasty poisons, but we're not even allowed to spray that stuff here. And they're spraying it on agave crops all over Mexico. One of the last things I want to point out, besides this work that's happening in Sonora, there are really cool projects like the Fondo Agavero. And this is where small scale producers have gotten together and they realize the importance of saving regionally collected wild seed, not just to grow more plants and put them in the wild and cut them down, but to actually nurture these wild populations as an important source of food for the bats and in general for biodiversity. They're taking the seeds. They just built this really cool seed bank that I'm really proud of them for doing. And they're getting funding from other mezcal producers. And so they're able to start saving these seeds. They're partnering with a bunch of different growers. And I really hope to see more regional efforts like this pop up that are Mexican-led and are where they're able to partner and talk to different organizations that are doing this work because everyone needs help, and we wouldn't be, our native plant program at Borderlands wouldn't be where we were if we didn't ask a bunch of really smart plant people questions. And I hope that's something that the whole scientific community can do better, is like ask each other questions and don't be afraid to not know. And just do a better job of supporting each other, because Fondo Agavero isn't going to be able to do this work all by themselves. They're going to need a lot of other help within Mexico and other programs within Mexico, and Borderlands Restoration Network and Watershed Management Group. We can't do all of this work by ourselves. This is something that should be community efforts to protect these cute little bats. This is the contact information for following Bat Conservation International. They have an amazing website. They have a really cool magazine. I just highly recommend them as an organization. They're great to work with. They've been really supportive and are always happy to talk to people. And then here's my contact information. If you want to write it down or take a picture, for if you have questions or you want to ever volunteer with us or come visit the nursery. We haven't had as much rain as we usually do, but we're a lot cooler here at 4,000 feet elevation than in Tucson. So you're always welcome to come visit and look at the pretty plants that we're growing for baby bats and for all kinds of plants of the world, animals of the world. Thank you guys, appreciate it.
Wow, thank you so much, Francesca. I don't see any question in the chat, but we have 4 minutes. So if anyone has a question, go ahead, Darcy.
That was a clap. I was clapping for you,
Okay.
Francesca.
No
Thank
questions
you.
then.
I could ask a question. Thank you for that really fantastic talk, Francesca. I was wondering if the Perry's agave, which you say isn't really flowering at the right time for the long nose, lesser long nose, Mexican long nose, is there another species of bat that's no longer present that used to pollinate that? Or what's the story there?
Possible, or we had year-round nectar feeding bats. Like it's totally possible. To me, it is so bizarre that we have a pretty good presence of agave perryi, especially the variety Huachucensis in our mountains, and the bats just aren't here. But maybe there were more cold tolerant year-round bats. Like BCI doesn't know. To me, that would make sense. But again, like I think Wendy Hodgson, who's one of the best agave scientists and researchers in the world, I love her take on the whole agave for bat situation, because she's always like, everyone talks about how if the bats aren't doing well, the agaves are going to have a hard time. But she's like, the agaves will figure it out. Like agaves have all kinds of cool pollinators. It's the bats that need agave help. She's like, get it right. So I do love that like point of view with just like plants will find a way, they'll figure it out. But I've thought about that too, where I'm just like, they're putting out these definite like bat attracting flowers and the bats are just not here. So, but you know, plant lifespans are like, are just like hanging out a lot longer than these poor bats. Maybe we had 10 species of nectar feeding bats and we slowly killed them all off because we're jerks. I don't know.
Thank you, Iman. Nice seeing you here. Okay, we have a question in the chat. Are other agaves also beneficial for bats, like Huhucam?
Are there other agaves? So the big thing is so agave deserti actually is a good agave in lower elevation regions. For bats, they have an early flowering like the perryi, and the phenology matches up with them. So agave deserti is another good agave that they have on the bat list. Agave shadii is a lot smaller, but is also a good agave for this region. They don't produce as much nectar. It's the Shindagger agave, very aptly named, but they're smaller agaves. They're like maybe a foot to 2 feet wide all over the place. The Hohokam agave is not actually that great of an agave for bats, partly because they do produce some nectar, but then those flowers, like it's a domesticated agave. So the flowers kind of peter out and die, and then they produce bulbils where the flowers were. So they don't put as much nectar into the flowers as then more energy to create clones, which is really cool. Hohokam agaves are like so cool, but partly because they're domesticated. And if you think about how long it takes like to domesticate corn, and that's a plant that flowers every year, imagine how long it took to domesticate a plant that flowers once a decade. It's pretty cool.
Okay, Francesca, do you have a couple of more minutes to answer more questions?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, how about octopus agave?
Octopus is kind of similar. It's also one that has a columnar flowering structure versus a palmate flowering structure. And it produces bulbils from the base. So it's not as great of an agave for bats, but the bats, you know, they'll hit it, of course. If it has nectar, like the bat will go up to it. But it's not, yeah, it's not as ideal for agave nectar. And then I've read about the Freeport Mines conservation efforts with BCI. Is that something that is worth paying attention to for bats as a potential site? The Freeport work with BCI, so we're an organization that doesn't work with mining companies because of all the drama of the current South 32 mine in the Patagonia Mountains that's decimating our area. BCI works with Freeport a lot, partly because a lot of abandoned mine shafts host a ton of bats. So as an organization, they work, you know, a lot with mining companies that then also fund some of these restoration efforts. I feel like wherever, if Freeport is happy to pay for agaves through BCI, like it's, you know, we can then monitor the sites, we can then figure out how they're doing. So I do think it's worth it whenever these efforts are funded. And some of the, you know, they've put them around like Bisbee, there are maternity caves over in that neck of the woods. Like the plantings they've done have been in the smart effort. Something else that Freeport's done that we've participated in once and will never participate in again is they had a big agave Perrier salvage in New Mexico for this like strip mining stuff they were doing. They're just like clearing out all this land. And there were all these cool agave Perriers there. And we went and got a bunch of them and replanted a bunch and then kept some of them at the nursery. And because they were wild agaves and, you know, we felt good about salvaging them, they actually brought mites and the agave beetle into our nursery. And we were like screwed for almost 2 years where we don't use pesticides. So we had to just cull a bunch of our agaves. It was kind of awful. And so they're still offering the salvage work for organizations that work with them, which I think is worth doing. But for our program, because we don't spray, it was just kind of devastating and was a big pain in the butt for us, where it put us way behind on agave production. So we're really careful at our nursery of like growing things from seed because you're not bringing in other plants that can carry disease. So it taught me to be more careful with our salvage work too. But yeah, I think, you know, we don't work with the mines, but BCI definitely does. And they've had a long-standing and I think good relationship with them for a long time. I hope that answered your question, Joy. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Joy.
Oh, well, I don't see any other questions, so I think it's time to wrap this up. Thank you so much, Francesca. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope to see you this Wednesday talking about bats because it's Bat Month with WMG.
For organizing it, you're awesome. I love you.